When you think German battleship, you probably think of Bismarck. Maybe Tirpitz or Scharnhorst if you don't go for the obvious answer. This is fair. Those ships are, for very obvious reasons, the famous German battleships, completely eclipsing any of the old imperial dreadnoughts, regardless of which one of those you look at. Despite this, those ships weren't the first German battleships to fight in the Second World War. It wouldn't be the modern fast battleships that opened that conflict. It would be an antique old pre-dreadnought, a relic from a different era, and one with a difficult to pronounce name. That being SMS Schleswig-Holstein, though by 1939 she had lost the SMS part of the name. This was a pre-dreadnought laid down in 1905 for the Imperial German Navy. That she endured into the Second World War was a quirk of various treaties, most notably Versailles, which saw the old ship retained as one of 8 pre-dreadnoughts that Germany could keep. This kept the ship around in active service longer than any other pre-dreadnought in the end, alongside her slightly longer-lived sister, Schlesien. Granted, in either Reichsmarine or Kriegsmarine, the ship wasn't really seen as an active combatant. She was mostly used for training duty, as the ship was obsolescent when she entered Imperial service, and thoroughly obsolete beyond that point. Nonetheless, she did retain her guns, and that is important, because it did, after all, result in her famous moment of firing the opening shots of World War II, opening fire on Polish shore positions on September 1st, 1939. For better or worse, no other warship can claim the same, to have fired the opening salvo of the most destructive war in human history. And it will forever be what this ship is known for, despite it coming so late into her career. Which is, I suppose, the point to talk about that career in more detail. As noted, this began in 1905. The battleship was laid down in Kiel on August 18, 1905, with a relatively fast construction period, seeing the ship launched on December 17th of 1906, with her commissioning as SMS Schleswig-Holstein following on July 6, 1908. A little under 3 years to complete, which is perfectly in line with most peacetime battleships, unless you're the British pumping out dreadnoughts as fast as humanly possible. That said, by 1908, the ship was already obsolescent at absolute best. Schleswig-Holstein would, in fact, be Germany's final pre-dreadnought. Following her, they shifted to the Nassau-class dreadnought, leaving Schleswig-Holstein outdated as soon as she entered the water. Let's look at what the Germans got with their last pre-dreadnought before we move on. This battleship displaced around 13,200 tons at her normal loading, going up to 14,200 when fully loaded. This was pretty typical by pre-dreadnought standards, something that also applied to the weaponry. The standard pre-dreadnought loadout of 4 big guns and 2 twin turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern. Where Schleswig-Holstein differed from the standard was in the size of those guns. By the time this ship entered service, 12-inch or 305mm was the standard. Germany opted for a smaller, faster-firing weapon, the 28cm or 11-inch gun, with Schleswig-Holstein carrying a total of 4 barrels. To support these, the ship carried 14 17cm, 6.7-inch secondary guns, These were carried in typical single casement mountings and supported in turn by 22 88mm guns in single mountings for defense against torpedo boats, with all of this rounded off by the usual submerged torpedo tubes, in this case 6 of them, 2 on either broadside with 1 each in the bow and stern. All of this protected by a main belt of 240mm or 9.4 inches in thickness, with this thinning down to 170mm, 6.7 inches at the lower end. And further, in classic pre-dreadnought style, the ship also had 100mm or 3.9 inches of armor at either end of the ship, with 170mm of teak backing the main belt. For its part, the deck armor came out to 40mm, 1.6 inches in thickness. Now, to finish this section off, let's touch on the speed. This was actually fairly fast by pre-dreadnought standards. She managed 19 knots on sea trials. Although, as always, caveat that with on trial. Schleswig-Holstein would be more like 18 knots on average. Still respectable for her type. In any event, however, that rounds this section off. We can now return to service where we left off on July 6th of 1908. Commissioned with crew trained on her sister Schlesien, the new Schleswig-Holstein joined the fleet. A fleet that was, of course, in the middle of peacetime. This would mean training and fleet exercises would be the name of the game. Schleswig-Holstein would spend her early service, 1908 through 1914, on this kind of duty. That isn't particularly surprising, all things being equal, but it's also reflective of how fast she was pushed aside by the newer ships. In the event the Germans did need to show the flag, they had dreadnoughts for that, or even the battle cruisers. Take, for example, SMS Moltke's voyage to New York. Schleswig-Holstein, on the other hand, had little reason to sail far from home. From what I've been able to find, she spent most of her time in the Baltic, along with the odd voyage into the Atlantic, although these were still fleet exercises. In any event, other than winning a gunnery award in 1913, there's not much to note for the early service. Excitement for Schleswig-Holstein only really came when the Great War broke out in late July of 1914. For a certain value of excitement, it must be said. If you watched my previous video on SMS Hessen, a lot of this will sound familiar. Regardless, when the war began, Schleswig-Holstein was based on guard duty off the Elbe River. In this, she was part of the 2nd Battle Squadron. Made up of other pre-dreadnoughts, this formation spent most of its time fairly close to home, either on refit, guard duty, or escorting the newer ships. That said, the Germans did come close to putting Schleswig-Holstein to work in actual combat. A quirk of the High Seas Fleet, in comparison to other navies, was using their newer pre-dreadnoughts with the dreadnoughts. Well aware of their limitations in number compared to the Royal Navy, the German command saw little other choice. Slow, outdated, and underarmed. All of those apply to the pre-dreadnoughts. But they were still battleships, and the Germans still saw some use for them in that particular role. As a result, Schleswig-Holstein would sail on a couple attempts to engage the British. Mostly sweeps of the North Sea that amounted to nothing. Something that would continue from late 1914 into early 1916. Probably the closest she came to engaging the British was on December 16th of 1914, as the battlecruisers returned from raiding Britain. And even this came to nothing, with the result that Schleswig-Holstein's first and only time engaging the British came at Jutland on May 31st of 1916, as was often the case for capital ships on both sides. Even in this, however, her role would be fairly limited. The 2nd Battle Squadron, in this case 6 pre-dreadnoughts, just couldn't keep up. As Scheer and Hipper sailed to engage the British, the older battleships fell behind. And even when they did catch up, well, they were often on the unengaged side of the German fleet. The closest Schleswig-Holstein came to combat was when the battleship joined her sisters in covering the battlecruisers. At this point, after their death ride, Hipper's Großkreutzer were a wreck, so the pre-dreadnoughts sailed between them and the British battlecruisers late in the day on May 31st. By this point, with darkness approaching and the air choked with smoke, visibility was terrible. Schleswig-Holstein couldn't find a target, so she didn't open fire. She did, on the other hand, take a hit of her own, most likely from HMS New Zealand. This single hit punched into the superstructure, disabling one of her secondary guns. 3 men would be lost, with 8 or 9 wounded. She would also engage British destroyers later that night. At this point, the German ship escaped home, after firing 20 shells from her secondary battery. You could say that Schleswig-Holstein did little at Jutland, and in fairness that would be true. But the pre-dreadnoughts, in taking fire off the Großkreutzer, might well have saved Hipper's squadron. And that is no small feat. However, this would be the end of her active combat duty, at least in the Great War, which did allow her to survive the entire conflict. Although in most circumstances, she probably would have been scrapped. That said, post-Versailles Germany was not most circumstances. The High Seas Fleet was gone, with the Reichsmarine replacing it. And under the treaty restrictions, Germany could only retain 8 pre-dreadnoughts, 6 active and 2 in reserve. In practical terms, only about 4 would ever be in service at any one time, with Schleswig-Holstein being one of them, with the ship eventually becoming fleet flagship in January 1926, after an extensive refit. This saw her foremast replaced, along with the aft superstructure being built up for admiral use. More notably, the ship lost her secondary battery. Her old 17-centimeter guns were replaced by 15-centimeter, 5.9-inch weapons. In this case, 12 of them, while only 8 of the 88mm guns were retained, along with 4 torpedo tubes, with those tubes being above water instead of submerged. In this new layout, the battleship would spend her time on training cruises and port visits. The German fleet wouldn't get up to much else in the 1920s. In fact, the most notable thing to happen to Schleswig-Holstein was probably losing a funnel in a further 1927 refit, reducing her to 2 funnels and giving her the look she retained for the rest of her service. Not much else of note would happen between 1928 and 1935, with Schleswig-Holstein removed from her flagship role on September 22, 1935, as the new Panzerschiff came into service. Even the Reichsmarine, or by that point the Kriegsmarine, had little real use for the ship, at least as an active combatant. Schleswig-Holstein would instead be used as a cadet training ship. Her torpedo tubes and upper deck secondaries were removed, with the ship gaining a new mixed propulsion as her aft boilers were replaced by oil-fired models. She retained coal-fired boilers in the forward boiler rooms. In this new form, the battleship would round out the interwar on long-term training voyages, including as far as South America. This would likely have been the end of her service, too, were it not for the government in Germany. While outdated and largely disarmed, Schleswig-Holstein remained a combat-capable warship, and this would see her moored off Danzig on September 1st of 1939, specifically close to a Polish ammunition depot at Westerplatte, where the ship would remain as Germany invaded Poland that day. While German land and air forces moved on Poland, it would be the antique old Schleswig-Holstein that fired the first shots of the Second World War. Around 5 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, she opened fire, a signal for a land attack that actually failed in the first round. It wouldn't be until September 7th that German land forces forced the final Poles to surrender, even with gunfire support from the old pre-dreadnought. After this, Schleswig-Holstein continued to shell Polish positions for the rest of the month, with only light damage from Polish shore batteries on September 25th, 1939. Following this, the battleship would have a break as an icebreaker into early 1940, with her next combat action coming in the invasion of Denmark in April of 1940. As the Danes largely avoided fighting back, there was little for Schleswig-Holstein to do. And with the war moving beyond the Baltic, the battleship was pulled from combat duty. Schleswig-Holstein would spend the rest of 1940 through to 1943 on either icebreaker or training duty, aside from a short stint in May 1941 moored off Denmark, on the chance the Soviets tried to make a breakout. Otherwise, not much of note, with the battleship paid off on March 31st, 1943, as the German fleet was reduced following Barents Sea. It wouldn't be until February 1944 that Schleswig-Holstein returned to service, once more as a training ship, at least at first. However, with the German situation getting worse, the ship was swapped to convoy escort duty by the end of the year. This mostly involved the fitting of a much stronger anti-aircraft battery along with new generators. As it would turn out, she wouldn't see service in this role. The old battleship, while under refit, was bombed by the RAF at Gotenhaven on December 18, 1944. Attempts to keep her afloat failed, with Schleswig-Holstein settling on the bottom. The ship would initially see use as a stationary gun battery, but even this would be short-lived. By January 26, 1945, she would be abandoned, with the old battleship scuttled by charges on March 21st of 1945. Even this wouldn't be the end of her story, however. The ship was salvaged by the Soviets, brought up from the bottom, towed to the Gulf of Finland, and sunk in shallow water as a target, where what remains of the ship is still there to this day, although little is recognizable. The ship lasted in that target role until at least 1966. As such, Schleswig-Holstein technically saw some form of use for about 50 years, even if her most famous moment was, of course, in September 1939. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.